Kidmissing TV. I'm your host, Angelina Wilson. Today we're going to talk about the White House Boys. This was a case that took place in the 1950s and 60s in Marianna, Florida. Marianna, Florida is up in that little strip of Florida where Pensacola is. At the Dozier School for Boys or the Florida Industrial School for Boys, either way, a reform school. A horrible place. This case was first brought to light by one of the victims, one of the survivors, Roger Dean Kaiser. I had the privilege of having him on Kidmissing Radio twice. Unfortunately, both have been deleted. That's why I switched. So these boys were abused at this school. Some died for various reasons. Some were killed, both intentionally and unintentionally. I will link both websites for the White House Boys in the description. They got the name White House Boys, by the way, because there was a building they called the White House, where they were taken to be beaten. There are pictures on the poster at my right of this building. There's also a picture there of the plaque that has been placed. And Roger wrote the book on what happened to these boys. And some of the things just horrific. The things that were allowed to happen to them, the sexual abuses, the physical abuses, over decades. Because the White House Boys may have been in the 50s and 60s, but other boys continued to be abused until the school was shut down around the year 2000. So this was decades, 5-6 decades of horrendous abuse. As a matter of fact, when they renamed it the Dozier School, it was actually renamed after one of the abusers, which was a huge slap in the face to those poor men. It is very difficult for a man to talk about sexual abuse, even more so than a woman. The Florida Senate actually was unanimous in the exhumation order of the cemetery at the school. They want to know how many children are buried there, not to mention the families that just want their kids back. They never got their kids back. Several have been identified and returned to their families. Quite a number have not been yet identified. There are more graves there than there are records, which hit the anthropologists and archaeologists right in the head because they were stunned, blown away. They should have known to expect that in a way, kind of, but at the same time, who expects the records to be so flipping horrible? Now, getting back to the White House, what you see in the pictures, I'm going to give you a description of a beating. This is not for children, although children suffered it as young as 9 years old. They would lay them flat on the bed. They would make them bite into a filthy pillow. Hold on to the metal bed rails. These are the old-fashioned metal beds. I don't know if you're familiar with them. And be beaten with it's a leather strap, but it had like a piece of metal sandwiched inside of it. And they would be beaten until their underwear were embedded in their rear ends. Their backs would be bloodied. Their butts and their legs would be bloodied. It was awful. And the original purpose of that building, it was an ice cream shop. This is where they made ice cream. That's beyond sick. Um, what do you say to that? So this past year, moving ahead to bodies, as I mentioned, they began the excavation. Actually, they began it in about 2018 or 19. And this past year, they were able to give more, as I mentioned, boys back to their families. But again, the records do not match. They know that they had a fire. They know that they've had, over time, outbreaks of disease, which in communal settings like that, it's not unusual to have outbreaks of disease. So those graves they expected. There's one boy in particular that they were looking for. I don't have his name here. That his family desperately wanted him back, and they wouldn't give him back. Because presumably the family would find out he was murdered, shot, because he tried to escape the horrific abuse. One boy was abused so bad he was paralyzed. And he was sent back and subsequently died. His family never wanted him to go back. The court forced it. This was a little child. He was like 8, 9 years old. The youngest that you could be to go there. Absurd. The things that happen to these boys, as a matter of fact, you can listen. If you can stomach it and not want to throw your computer out a window, on YouTube is all the depositions and testimony of Tidswell, the one-armed man, who did most of the abusing of these boys, who administered most of the beatings of these boys, because they did go to court several years ago, and I believe they won. It was a civil thing because the criminal statute of limitations had run out. There shouldn't be a statute of limitations for that, but and you can hear a lot of that, like I said, on YouTube. If you look up Dozier School for Boys or Tidswell, or I can't remember his first name, but he was a one-armed teacher, and the one arm that he had, he used. There were dorm fathers, some of which were actually very nice and would take care of the boys when they got beaten and stuff. According to all of my research and what Roger has written. And they even stood up for the kids. There were reports, and you can read these online. The whole stinking thing is online, where you can read what was known when it was known. If I can find the link, I'll link it. And what I'll do is I will try to find the video of Tidswell. It's like 5 parts, but if I find the first part, you'll be able to get the rest. And I'll put it up in the little card up above the top so that you can click on it and take a listen or watch if you can handle it. I did. It's like 5 or 6 parts, 5 or 6 hours of stomaching this man. But it was interesting. And I read all the documents, all the things that were known, all the times that things had been reported. There was a boy excuse me, they had, because it was the South and it was the 50s and 60s, they were segregated. So they had a black side and a white side. Um, and one day, they were in the laundry room, because that's where most of the black kids worked. And for some reason, one of the adults overseeing the laundry room had a kid throw another kid into the industrial dryer and turn it on. Said kid was killed. Said kid was buried. Another kid they're looking for, I believe an African American kid. He only had a nickname in the book. Truly disgusting. The things that happened there. The nurse used to pull pieces of underwear out of these boys' skin on their rear ends. Why did she not report it? Oh, then you have the psychologist that worked there who brought a friend with him. And they both abused the kids sexually. I knew a psychologist like that. That would have done that in a heartbeat. He would have loved to work at a place like that. He would have fit right in. A school psychologist, nonetheless, whose name I will not use. I will redact. But he would have fit right in. Anyway. These boys were not criminals. That's something I want you to understand. Yes, it was reform school. Some of these boys were playing orphans, like Roger. He started out in an orphanage, being abused by nuns. Then he was sent to the Dozier School. Many of these boys were sent there for stupid, petty, tiny little things. Because, as it was found out, and there are actual written records of this as well, there was a judge. I guess he was getting kickbacks for sending as many boys as he could there. Sorry. And so he would send boys there for the stupidest, pettiest things imaginable just to get that kickback. And all of this was dug up later by these brave men. Some of the men have since passed away. Many of the men ended up in adult prison, understandably. Most turn their lives around after spending short times in adult prisons. Some never spent time in adult prisons. Roger did for a very short time, but he turned his life around. He gave it to Christ. He married a wonderful woman. Had a family. Many of them did. Most of their wives are very supportive of what they've done. And if you read comments, by the way, underneath those videos, you will see comments from kids that were there in the 80s, the 90s, and when it closed in the early 2000s. It just didn't end. And you know what I kept thinking of as I read the book and as I read the transcripts and thought about the time period, and I couldn't help think about my own father. My own father would be about the age of these men, of these White House boys. And I couldn't help but think of him and imagining him in their shoes. And it just broke my heart for them even more, knowing that he was their age and lived in that same time period. But for the grace of God, you know. So that's one of the things that struck me in reading it, and I know I have so many notes here, but I know most of it by heart. Matter of fact, it was December of 2012 when they used ground penetrating radar to find graves. They found 50, which is already more than they knew about. Um, it, like I said, you see the plaque, they had the ceremony. Ceremony doesn't kill pain. The emotional pain of what was done. The nightmares. The PTSD. I am sure that Tidswell has had to answer to God by now, because he was a pretty darned old man when they got him into court. The other abusers, Dozier, some of the psychologists and some of the other people, his cohort, who was a cop, are all gone. All had to answer on their judgment day for what they did. Even though they never had to answer to the criminal law here, they had to answer to the ultimate law above. Again, I just want to give you the two websites, then I'll link them below. TheWhiteHouseBoys.com and OfficialWhiteHouseBoys.org. I want to thank you for listening, because this case is so important. And I want to thank the men who were brave enough to tell their stories. I have a list of their names here. Bryant Middleton, Michael O'McCarthy, Don Stratton, Dick Colon, President of the White House Boys Association, Robert Straley, Jerry Cooper, who is the assistant president. Some 81 boys lost their lives at the Dozier School, or Florida Industrial School for Boys. That's ridiculous. That is unacceptable. They also had another school in South Florida, which by all accounts was just as bad. They really have to look at that system and reform the system, because it's just unacceptable to treat our children this way. Regardless of whether or not they did anything, which most of these kids had not. These kids were as young as 9 years old. They were aged 9 to 17. In some cases 8 to 17, but that was as young as they went. I can't imagine why you would ever put a child that young in a place. Leave them at home. Let mom and dad ground them, for gosh sakes, if they did something that they need correction for. You know, they're 8, 9. Like I said, they went all the way up to 17. Many of them were just plain orphans, and some of them, as I mentioned, were sent there simply because the judge got a kickback. The one boy who was paralyzed got better, went back, and died. His parents didn't want him there. There was no reason to send him back there. They said he was an out-of-control kid or something. And his parents said there was no reason to send him there in the first place. And now you want to send him back after they almost killed him. Oh, and they killed him. So it's frustrating. Because, again, statute of limitations. They can't prove homicide for the most part with skeletal remains, and that's what they have. So they're concentrating on DNA and returning children to their families, to their siblings, mostly because their parents are gone. or whoever's left in their families. So just keep these men in your thoughts and prayers as they continue on spreading the word. As of last year, they were still excavating. It's a long, slow process with the state archaeologist, forensic anthropologists, and thank the good Lord above, the school is closed.